There's a table under a canvas awning somewhere in Indian Territory, and there's a line in front of it. The line is families. Grandmothers, babies on hips, men who took the day off from a field they will not own much longer. They have walked in from farms scattered across a nation that is about to stop existing. And at the front of that line, there is a man with a ledger, and he is going to write down what they are. He asks their names, he asks who their parents were, and then he does the thing that will outlive every single person standing in that heat. He looks at their faces, and he decides. If he decides one way, he writes a fraction next to your name, 1/2, 1/4, 1/16. If he decides the other way, he writes nothing at all in that column. He leaves it empty. And 120 years later, in an office in Oklahoma, a woman will open an envelope and read a letter explaining that she is not who she says she is because of the space that man left blank. Let me tell you how that happened. To understand the table, you have to understand something most Americans were never taught, and I want to say it plainly rather than dance around it, because the dancing is part of the problem. The Cherokee Nation held people in slavery, not as a footnote, not marginally. Of the 5 tribes forced out of the Southeast, the Cherokee held the most enslaved black people, and the wealthiest Cherokee families ran plantations that would have looked entirely familiar to a Georgia planter, because they were designed to. Same crops, same houses, same arithmetic of who works and who profits. And then in 1838, the United States came for the Cherokee. You know this part. You've seen the paintings. 15,000 people driven west across 800 miles of winter, thousands dying of cold and hunger and dysentery, on a road that would come to be called the Trail of Tears. Here's the part that isn't in the paintings. Black people walked it too. They walked it in chains, or close enough. They hunted for food along the route. They cooked. They chopped the wood. They nursed the Cherokee sick. They stood guard over the camps at night while everyone else slept. They went ahead of the column to clear the obstructions off the road, which means that on the worst road in American memory, they walked it further than anyone. One Cherokee man alone, one of the richest in the nation, brought around 200 enslaved people west with him. Of the people held in bondage by Cherokee owners, at least 175 are recorded as dying on the way. The historian Tia Miles put something about this that I haven't been able to shake. Removal was awful for everyone, she said, but if you were wealthy in the Southeast, you got to start over in the West with a captive labor force. You had a leg up. On the road that broke a nation, some people were still property. And here is the document that did it for me. One of the removal parties kept a journal. Most didn't. The entries are short, weather and mileage, the ordinary bookkeeping of moving thousands of people who don't want to go. And in December of 1837, there are 2 lines. One says they stopped to bury a wagoner, a black boy, who died that morning. The next day they left 2 more behind, sick, at a farmhouse. No names, not one. The journal records the mileage that day. It does not record who they buried. That is the beginning of this story, and I want you to hold on to it. The erasure did not start with the Dawes Commission. It started with a man who had a pen and a column for distance, and no column for a child's name. They arrived in the West with nothing, and they rebuilt, and the plantations came back with them. Which is why, 4 years later, the largest slave revolt in the history of Indian Territory happened on Cherokee land. In the autumn of 1842, enslaved people on Cherokee farms locked their overseers in and went south. Dozens of them, men, women, and children, on foot and on stolen horses, heading for Mexico, because Mexico had abolished slavery, and a person could stop being property simply by crossing a line drawn on a map. A combined Cherokee and Creek posse rode them down. The runaways spotted the riders coming across open prairie with nowhere on earth to hide. So they went into a buffalo wallow, a shallow scoop in the ground, wide enough to hold them and their animals, with no cover at all beyond the lip of the dirt. Most of them had never fired a weapon in their lives. They decided to fight anyway. 2 of them were killed in that hollow. A dozen were dragged back into bondage. But the fight convinced the posse it needed reinforcements before finishing the job, and it turned around, and in the hours that bought, the rest of them ran. I think about that dip in the ground more than almost anything else I found. Somewhere in Oklahoma, there is a shallow place in a field where a group of people who had been told their whole lives that they were objects decided, together, in about 90 seconds, that they were not. Nobody put a marker on it. Now, what happened after the war is the part nobody expects. The Cherokee Nation sided largely with the Confederacy. I say largely carefully, because what actually happened was worse and more human than a side. The nation tore itself apart. There were Cherokee who fought for the South, and Cherokee who fought for the Union, and Cherokee families that had already been split by the removal a generation earlier, splitting again along a new seam. A Cherokee general commanded Confederate troops in Indian Territory and was among the last to surrender in the entire war. Homes were burned by men who lived 20 miles away. It was a civil war inside a civil war, fought on land they had been driven onto by the country now fighting over them. And in the middle of that, the enslaved people on those farms were doing the arithmetic everyone in the South was doing that year. Which way does this have to go for me to be free? When the Confederacy lost, the United States made the tribes sign new treaties, and in 1866, the Cherokee signed one that freed as many as 2,500 people held in bondage inside the nation. And then the treaty did something remarkable. Article 9 of that document said those people, and all their descendants, would have all the rights of native Cherokees. All the rights, not some, not conditional, not for a while, and for a long stretch of time. This is the part that gets left out of the angry version of this story. It actually worked. Freedmen descendants voted in Cherokee elections. They ran businesses in Cherokee towns. Some of them spoke Cherokee because they'd grown up in it. They went to the stomp dances. They knew the stories. Several of them served on the tribal council and held district seats. They were not tolerated guests. They were citizens, doing citizen things, in a nation they had helped build with unpaid labor and had every treaty right to belong to. And their children grew up inside that. Understand what that means practically. It means a kid born in the Cherokee Nation in 1880 who was black grew up going to Cherokee schools, hearing Cherokee spoken around him, going to the grounds when the dances happened, being from somewhere in a way that most black Americans of that exact generation, in Mississippi or Alabama, absolutely were not. They had a nation, a flag, a court system, a capital, a newspaper, and a treaty with their name in it. So how do you get from that to a rejection letter? You get there through paperwork, and I need you to understand that the paperwork was not an accident, because that's the whole thing. By the 1890s, the United States had decided the 5 tribes should not exist as nations anymore. The land they held in common was going to be broken up and handed out in individual parcels, and the moment land stops being held in common and starts being held by one person with a deed, it can be bought. It can be mortgaged. It can be swindled off a widow who can't read the document she's signing, which is exactly what happened, on a scale that is hard to describe. Allotment was the largest transfer of land out of native hands in the history of the country, and it was accomplished mostly with paper rather than guns. But to hand out parcels, you need a final list, a final, authoritative, government-certified list of every human being entitled to a share. That's the Dawes Commission. That's the table under the awning. And the commission did not make one list. Before we get to what they wrote, understand what getting to that table cost. The enrollment offices were not near most people. Families walked or rode for days to reach one. And if you arrived and the office had moved, or the party had passed through your district already, that was simply that. Some people spoke Cherokee and no English, and depended on an interpreter they'd never met to render their own family history to a stranger. Some couldn't read what was being written about them. There was outright corruption among some of the officers, and there were people who were told to come back, and came back, and were told again. Thousands of people who had every right to be on that list are not on it. Not because they were rejected, because they never physically got there, or got there on the wrong day, and the rolls closed anyway. That's the machine. Now here's what it did to the people who did reach the front of the line. It made separate lists. Cherokee by blood on one, freedmen on another, intermarried whites on a third. Now here's where it turns, and I'm going to say it slowly because it is the single most important sentence in this video. On the by blood list, the commission wrote down a blood quantum for every person. A fraction. Full, half, quarter, eighth, 32nd. On the freedmen list, they wrote nothing in that column. Nothing. Not zero. Not unknown. Blank. And that blank was applied to people who were, provably, related to the people on the other list. Same families, same grandmothers. Brothers and sisters split across two rolls because one of them looked more like their Cherokee parent, and one of them looked more like their African one. Think about what that means at a kitchen table. Two children of the same mother and father. One gets a fraction written beside his name, and with it a permanent, federally certified claim on the nation he was born in. The other gets a blank, and a form asking who owned his mother. Same blood, same house, same everything, different column. And neither of them knows, standing there in the heat, that they have just been separated for the next 120 years by a man who will never think about them again. The commission's practice was to enroll people of visibly mixed heritage as freedmen and record no blood relation to the tribe at all. If you were black and Cherokee, the column for Cherokee simply did not apply to you. I want you to sit with the physical object for a second, because I think about this more than I'd like to. The freedmen enrollment cards were pre-printed forms, and on those forms, right there in the layout, were fields the clerk was meant to fill in. Slave of, father's owner, mother's owner. That was the form. Your identity, as recorded by the United States government in the year 1900, in the space where another person's identity had a fraction, was the name of the man who had owned your mother. And the fractions themselves? They weren't science. They weren't even careful. Commission workers estimated blood degree largely by guesswork, by what a family said, by what a neighbor said, by what the man at the table thought he saw when he looked up. Which brings me to the thing that genuinely changed how I understand this whole subject. Blood quantum was not a Cherokee concept. The Cherokee had not historically decided who belonged by measuring fractions of ancestry. That is a European idea, an accounting method for property and race, and it arrived at that table in the hands of the federal government, along with the surveyors and the land offices. The United States taught the tribes to measure blood, wrote the first numbers itself, guessed at most of them, and then left the numbers behind when it walked away. That is my honest read on this, and I'll stand behind it. The most destructive thing the United States did to Native identity in that generation wasn't a battle. It was a filing system. If your family has a story about an ancestor whose paperwork never matched what everybody at the reunion knew to be true, subscribe, because that gap between the record and the family is the exact thing this channel exists to go into, and it comes up again in almost every one of these. Now, a blank space on a form is harmless right up until somebody decides to use it. For most of the 20th century, nobody did. The rolls closed. The land got allotted and largely lost. Freedmen descendants stayed citizens. In 1971, the Cherokee Nation issued citizenship cards, and freedmen descendants got them, and they voted in that year's election, and the one after that, and the one after that. Then the paperwork woke up. The nation began requiring citizens to show a card certifying degree of Indian blood, a number that could only come from one place. The Dawes rolls, and the freedmen column was empty. In 1983, freedmen descendants were turned away from the polls. Letters went out saying citizenship had been canceled because they could not produce a blood degree. There was no blood degree to produce. There never had been. A clerk had left it blank 80 years earlier, and now the blank was the reason. Picture the specific version of that. A man who voted in the last 3 elections walks up to the table with the same card in his hand that he has always used. He has known the woman checking names since they were children, and she has to tell him no. Not because anything about him changed, because a rule changed, and the rule pointed at a document neither of them had ever seen, filled out before either of them was born. That's what makes this different from most of the injustices we cover on this channel. Nobody had to do anything dramatic. There was no raid, no fire, no soldiers. Somebody simply decided which column counted, and 80 years of quiet clerical work did the rest. A law in the early 90s made it formal. A constitutional vote in 2007 made it harder still. Roughly 25,000 people were on the wrong side of it. Which is where Marilyn Vann comes in. She applied for citizenship. Her family had been in the Cherokee Nation for generations. Her father was on the rolls, on the Freedmen roll. The rejection came back in 2001, and she has described what it said. There was no degree of Indian blood attached to that roll number, and her reaction is the reaction of every person who has ever run into this, and it is the reason I wanted to make this video. She said, "What are they talking about? There's no degree of blood?" Because she knew what her family was. Everybody in that family knew what her family was. The only party in the entire arrangement that didn't know was a piece of paper filled out by a stranger in a tent before her father was born. So she sued. And I want to be honest about what that actually involves, because she sued makes it sound like a decision you make on a Tuesday. She was an engineer, not a lawyer, not an activist, not anybody with a platform. She built an organization out of nothing to represent people scattered across 5 nations and several states, most of whom had no money, and many of whom had been told their whole lives not to make trouble about this. She found attorneys willing to carry the case for years, largely without being paid. She sat through hearings and appeals and delays and versions of the argument that said her family had never really belonged in the first place. It took the better part of 25 years. And in 2017, a federal judge in Washington issued a 78-page ruling, and the language of it is worth understanding even if you don't care about law at all. The judge said the question was simple. Did the 1866 treaty give these people all the rights of native Cherokees, or didn't it? It did. And the ruling said something I keep rereading. That the Cherokee Nation can absolutely define itself however it sees fit. That's what a sovereign nation does. But it has to do it even-handedly. Neither group has rights superior to the other. Their fates rise and fall together. The Cherokee Nation did not appeal. They began accepting applications from freedmen descendants the next day. And years later, the nation's own principal chief sat in front of a Senate committee next to Marilyn Vann, and said out loud that for far too long, the Cherokee Nation had failed to keep a solemn promise. I don't think people expect that ending. I didn't. In a story with this much pain in it, somebody actually said, "We were wrong, and we're fixing it." But I'd be lying to you if I stopped there, because that is 1 nation out of 5. There are, by the government's own estimate, somewhere between 150,000 and 400,000 freedmen descendants across the 5 tribes. Some can enroll, some cannot. The Chickasaw and the Choctaw have not opened their rolls. And in the Muskogee Nation, the fight is happening right now. Their own Supreme Court ruled that the freedmen descendants are citizens under the same kind of 1866 treaty language. That ruling has not been carried out. Just days ago, 2 descendants took it to federal court to try to force the issue, 1 full year after they won. They still don't have cards. They still can't vote. They won, and they're still waiting. And there's a genuine tension underneath this that I don't want to flatten, because flattening it would be dishonest, and because it's the actual reason this is hard. A tribal nation deciding who its citizens are is not a technicality. It is the single most fundamental thing a nation does, and for Native nations, it was taken away, argued over, and only clawed back at enormous cost. Every time an outside court tells a tribe who belongs to it, something real is lost, even when the ruling is right. That's not a talking point. That's the thing people on that side are actually protecting, and they have 2 centuries of reasons to protect it fiercely. And on the other side are people whose great-grandparents were promised, in writing, by both governments, that this was already settled. Both of those are true at the same time. That's why this has taken 150 years instead of an afternoon. And there's a harder question underneath even that, which I don't think has an answer yet. You cannot fix this with a DNA test. I know that's what people want. Swab, result, settled. It doesn't work that way, and it shouldn't. Tribal citizenship is not a genetic category. It's a political relationship between a nation and its people, defined by treaty and by that nation's own law. And every serious person on every side of this agrees on that much. And I'll go further, because I think it matters. If a test could settle it, that would mean the man at the table was right all along. That there's some measurable substance in a person that determines whether they belong somewhere. He wasn't right. He was making it up. The fractions he wrote were guesses dressed as arithmetic, and the whole tragedy here is that a guess got treated as a measurement for 120 years, which means the blank column can't be filled in retroactively by science. There's no test that puts a fraction where the clerk put nothing. The only thing that can fix it is what the treaty said in the first place. A promise, kept. So let me take you back to the table. The man is still sitting there. The line still stretches out into the heat. A family reaches the front, and he asks their names, and he writes them down, and then he looks up at their faces and makes a decision about the column on the right. He has no idea what he's doing. I mean that literally. He thinks he's processing land applications. He thinks the fraction is a clerical detail, one field among a dozen on a form he'll fill out 400 more times before the season is out. He will finish this posting and go home and die and never learn that the empty box he left behind will outlast his name, his town, his handwriting, and every single acre of land he was there to distribute. The land is gone. Almost all of it. Sold, mortgaged, taken, lost inside 2 generations. The entire purpose of the exercise, undone. The box is still here. It's the reason a woman opened an envelope in 2001 and had to explain to a piece of paper who her own father was. It's the reason 2 people were standing in a federal courthouse in Oklahoma this month, 1 year after winning, still asking for a card. He didn't write anything in it. That turned out to be the most powerful thing anybody wrote down that day. Whose name is missing from the paperwork in your family?